Hey fam, we're back for race and how it is in fact an illusion. In part one, we talked about race and racial identity as being social constructs, and we specifically focused on the power of an illusion, if you recall, where I talked about a groundbreaking three-part series outlining how the myth of race took hold and continues to this day to hold or have its hold on our society. In part two, I want to discuss a wonderful piece of research I came across that will help you understand the origins and the politics behind this thing called race, and not only that, how many people coming from the new world to this one came first, you'd be surprised to know, uh, as free people and indentured servants. So let me open up with the research that I found. I think you will find this to be very interesting. This is a paper that was presented at the conference Race, Human Variation and Disease, Consensus and Frontiers, sponsored by the American Anthropological Association and funded by the Ford Foundation. The conference was an activity of AAA's Public Education Project, Race, funded by the Ford Foundation and the National Science Foundation, held March 14, 2007 in Warrenton, Virginia. The paper represents the views of the author and not necessarily the AAA Race Project. But I thought it was very interesting because it actually outlines how blacks and whites were equally valued, seen, and measured in society, and there was no concept that one was more superior than the other. And I think this is something that a lot of people do not understand, and it furthers my argument that since there was some consensus, or rather, there was a time where there was equality between the races. We did it once, we can do it again, but I want to point out how the division and the construct of the division was undermined and put into practice. This is, I think, you're going to find very interesting. This article is entitled "The History of the Idea of Race and Why It Matters." Audrey Smedley, professor of anthropology at Emerita, Virginia Commonwealth University. She starts her paper off very interestingly by saying, "The position taken by many anthropologists, both biological and social, and increasingly many other scholars in the social sciences, is that race is a cultural construct. It should be clear that this is not a definition or even a characterization of race, but an assertion about the scholarly or existential domain in which we can best examine and explain the phenomenon of race. Race should be analyzed as a social cultural reality that exists in a realm independent of biological or genetic variations." She goes on to say, "No amount of research into the biophysical or genetic features of individuals or groups will explain the social phenomena of race. When 5 white policemen shot a young, unarmed African immigrant 41 times in the doorway of his New York apartment, this can't be explained by examining their genes or biology. Nor can we explain employer preferences for white job applicants or discrimination in housing on any other of the social realities of racism by references to human biological differences. This does not mean that we deny that there is a biological basis for some human behaviors at the individual level, which is a perfectly legitimate perspective for those who are engaged in this kind of research. Nor does it mean that the existence of race as a cultural phenomenon has no impact on the biology of human beings. On the contrary, we know a lot about the sometimes devastating effects of race and racism on the biology and behavior of individuals and groups. Because of several hundred years of racism, during which both physical and psychological oppression have characterized the lives and environments of those people seen as members of low-status races, differences in health status and lifestyles among them have appeared and continue to impact us all. Here's where it gets really interesting. The significance of history. And this is what I talk about. This is why it's very important that we examine the origin of everything we believe today. In the middle 20th century, a new generation of historians began to look or take another look at the beginnings of the American experience. They spent decades exploring all of the original documents relating to the establishment of colonies in America. Get ready. It says, what these scholars discovered was to transform the writing of American history forever. Their research revealed that our 19th and 20th century ideas and beliefs about races did not in fact exist in the 17th century. Interesting. Race originated as a folk idea, an ideology about human differences. It was a social invention, not a product of science. Historians have documented when, and to a great extent, how race as an ideology came into our culture and our consciousness. This is the story that I will briefly tell here, she says. One of the first of the publications, and perhaps the one with the greatest impact, was a book by Edmund Morgan entitled American Slavery, American Freedom. It is the detailed story of Virginia, the first successful colony. On its publication, it was hailed as a classic that has inspired numerous other historians. The establishment of Jamestown in Virginia by English colonists occurred 400 years ago this year. And this was back in, she's saying 1607. At the time of the writing, it was 2007. She says, from the beginning, Jamestown was a crude, rough, and turbulent community of mostly young Englishmen who came to seek their fortune and then return home. They planned to emulate the Spanish, to obtain wealth by conquering and enslaving the native peoples, and forcing them to produce gold and silver. However, the Indians didn't take well to slavery. Many died of European diseases and others escaped to unknown territories. Also, there was no gold and silver immediately available. But settlers soon discovered a crop, tobacco, whose trade would bring them wealth. But growing and processing tobacco required very hard work. The greatest problem the colonists constantly faced was lack of labor. Many settlers would not or could not do such intensive work. Within a decade, the colony began to import indentured servants. And let's be clear, the indentured servants that they were importing were white. Some were black, but for the most part, they were a mixture. And they had the same status. So get this. Within a decade, as I said, they began to import indentured servants, mostly from England. And it was this pattern of servitude that provided a model for the slavery that was to come later. Servants were brought or bought and sold, ill-fed, ill-clothed, and poorly housed. They were punished cruelly for petty crimes. Mortality was high, but the surplus poor emigrating from England in the early 17th century had few choices. If they survived the period of debenture, usually 4 to 7 years in the New World, they could be set free, allowed to acquire land and servants, and to make their fortunes for themselves. So this kind of slavery, or indentured servitude as it was known, was only for a short period of time. However, there were many degrees of servitude, and most did not survive. So they had a hard time with this free labor they were trying to raise or establish. So, in 1619, the first Africans arrived. Here's where it gets really interesting because this is something I know a lot of you did not know. There has been some debate about who they were, but we know that they had Spanish or Portuguese names and were already familiar with European culture. In the U.S., it is widely and popularly believed that the colonists brought Africans to the New World as slaves from the beginning, and that Europeans were naturally prejudiced toward Africans because of their physical characteristics. Was that true, though? Specifically, their dark skin. Historians now hold that true slavery did not exist in the early decades of the English North. As a matter of fact, Englishmen were unfamiliar with the institution. They saw their society as a free one, based on free labor, and believed that English laws had terminated all forms of slavery centuries before their arrival in the Americas. But they were familiar with many forms of bond servitude, which they saw as unfree labor. And some men who purchased head rights to laborers treated them as if they were slaves for life. Masters were often brutal. They flogged their servants for disobedience, or cut off their ears, or put skewers through their tongues. But the settlers were also callous and cruel toward one another. Often servants were called Slavs or slaves, and a distinction between servitude and slavery was not at all clear at that point. Consequently, the first Africans who arrived in Jamestown were not initially or uniformly perceived as slaves. They were assimilated into the colony as laborers, under varying contracts like those of the Europeans or the other white servants, equal status. Some Africans worked off their debts and became freedmen. A few ambitious men obtained land and livestock, built substantial houses, married, and established themselves as well-to-do planters. These are black people we're talking about. Some became entrepreneurs and engaged in trading and other commercial activities and had businesses dealings on equal footing with whites. One famous family, that of Anthony Johnson and his two sons, owned more than 440 acres of land. They also had head rights for, that is, they owned 3 Africans, 3 Europeans, and 2 Indians as servants. Black people owning slaves. Get this. They exercised the same rights as propertied Europeans. They participated in the assembly, the governing body of the colony. They voted, they served on juries, and they socialized with white planters. Like their white counterparts, free black property owners were often contemptuous of government, arrogant, and insulting toward those considered their social inferiors, assertive of their rights, and prone to fighting. In fact, numerous court records provide clear evidence that these 17th century Africans did not act differently from whites of the same social class. Edmund Morgan wrote, "There is more than a little evidence that Virginians during these years were ready to think of Negroes as members or potential members of the community on the same terms as other men and to demand of them the same standards of behavior. Black men and white serving the same master worked, ate, and slept together, and together shared in escapades, escapes, and punishments. It was common for servants and slaves to run away together, steal hogs together, get drunk together. It was not uncommon for them to make love together." This is a history we're going to know about. No stigma was associated with what we today call intermarriage. It was normalized. It was quite natural. Black men servants often married white women servants. Records from one county reveal that 1/4 of the children born to European servant girls were mulatto. Historian Anthony Parent notes that 5 out of 10 black men on the eastern shore were married to white women. One servant girl declared to her master that she would rather marry a Negro slave on a neighboring plantation than him with all his property. And she did. Given the demographics, servant girls had their choice of men. One white widow of a black farmer had no problem with remarrying, this time to a white man. She later sued this second husband, accusing him of squandering the property she had accumulated with her first husband. In another case, A black woman servant sued successfully for her freedom and then married the white lawyer who represented her in court. By mid-century, the colony was in a crisis. A few men from among the earliest settlers had taken over most of the fertile land. They had established large plantations and grew tobacco to make huge fortunes. Poor servants who achieved their freedom found it difficult to acquire land. The freed poor and servants, which now included Europeans, Africans, mulattoes, and a few Indians, became unhappy with their lot, and especially the corruption and abuse of power on the part of wealthy men who ruled the colony. So they're about to have a mutiny here. And notice that you have blacks and whites working together against the landholder. This is what we need to understand. There's precedent for blacks and whites working together against who? The very wealthy, the landowners, our controllers. That's where I'm going with this. If we did it once before, we can do it again. Now, I'm not saying that we should formulate some kind of insurrection. I'm just simply saying that there is no precedent for the separation other than the one that was created between white people and black people. It's not natural for us to be against one another. It's more unnatural. Much of this behavior was totally learned and conditioned into us. That's where I'm going with this. The freed poor and servants, which now included Europeans, Africans, mulattoes, and a few Indians, became unhappy with their lot, and especially the corruption and abuse of power on the part of wealthy men who ruled the colony. I said that once, I'm going to say it again. They threatened rebellions, plundered their neighbors, showed contempt for colony leaders, and generated unrest throughout the settlement. Now, you can almost guess what's about to happen in terms of the rulers, the landowners, their reaction to this. They see these people working together. The best way to fight that is to divide and conquer. And I got a feeling that that's what's about to happen. Let's listen. In 1676, the most famous rebellion took place, led by Nathaniel Bacon. This uprising of thousands of poor workers was the first major threat to social stability. They had to do something about this. The rebellion dissipated after the death of Bacon, but British royal commissioners sent out to suppress the uprising realized that the population at large had supported the rebellion and were sullen and obstinate. On one occasion, they faced a dissatisfied rabble of 400 African and 600 or 700 European bond laborers, chiefly Irish. So we got blacks and Irish working together, both of them suffering the same status, right? They soon recognized the need for a stratagem to prevent such occurrences in the future and ensure that a sufficient number of controlled laborers were made available to plantation owners. So here we go. Get ready for this, because this is going to become, like I said, the divide and conquer strategy. The decisions that the rulers of the colony made during the last decades of the 17th century and the first quarter of the 18th century resulted in the establishment of racial slavery. Watch how they do it. They began to pass a series of laws separating out Africans and their descendants, restricting their rights and mobility, and imposing a condition of permanent slavery on them. Africans were now being brought directly from Africa. Yeah. Hold on. I stopped at Africans are now being brought directly from Africa. It states here that they were different from earlier Africans in that they were heathens, that is, not Christians, and were unfamiliar with European languages, customs, and traditions. Well, they had their own languages and customs. They were totally African. They had not been Europeanized, I guess. Some colony leaders began to argue that Africans had no rights under British laws and therefore could be subject to forced labor with impunity. This is odd because you have Africans that are already here who have one set of laws. Then you have Africans who are brought here who have no familiarity with whites, and so they take advantage of this difference, capitalize on it, and then make everybody with dark skin slaves, but with a difference. After 1672, British ships entered the slave trade, and the numbers of people shipped directly across the Atlantic greatly increased. 1672. Remember that year. There were critical reasons for the preference for Africans. As early as the 1630s, planters had expressed a desire for African laborers. If only we had some Africans. Records of plantation owners in the Caribbean and in the colonies of Virginia and Maryland reveal the fact that Africans were initially considered a civilized and docile people who had knowledge of and experience with tropical civilization or cultivation. They were accustomed to discipline, one of the hallmarks of civilized behavior, as well as working cooperatively in groups. So we were seen, that is to say Africans were seen, as quite civilized. They knew how to grow corn, they knew how to grow tobacco, sugar cane, and cotton in their native lands. These crops were unknown in Europe. And many Africans had knowledge of metalwork, carpentry, cattle keeping, brickmaking, weaving, leather tanning, and many other skills. So we're not talking about unskilled, uncivilized Africans. We're talking about people who were brought here, made to labor and build the colonies with their skills, surrounded by many on the white side who were purposely divided, who had maybe few skills, or at least in time it got to that point. Colonists soon realized that without Africans, their enterprises would fail. They often wrote, "We cannot survive without Africans." A good example is the history of the colony of Georgia. In the mid-18th century, this colony was founded, 1732, by followers of John Wesley, founder of Methodism, with the objective of settling here poor people from Europe. The founders and organizers had an anti-slavery policy, and Georgia became the first non-slave holding colony. But the experiment failed. The settlers endured hunger, disease, poverty, and many deaths. And when we say the settlers, we're talking about the whites at this time. They soon petitioned the trustees to alter the policy and to allow slaves. Once again, here we are working together to make sure that the white population survives and thrives. They argued that they could not survive without African slaves. Nearly 20 years after the founding, the act prohibiting slavery was repealed, and Georgia began to prosper. Although there were more Irish slaves in the Caribbean Isles than Africans, those peoples captured in wars with the English knew nothing about tropical agriculture and were seen as savages. They had a dangerous nature, is the tone they use here. They often ran away to join their co-religionists, the Catholic Spanish, and were considered a rebellious lot. Historian Leonard Liggio quoted from one letter sent to traders by a planter, "Don't send us any more Irish. Send us some Africans, for the Africans are civilized and the Irish are not." In contrast to Indians, Africans also had natural immunities to old world diseases. European colonists recognized that Africans lived longer and were able to produce more than Europeans who had a high mortality rate. Moreover, Africans were in a strange land with no powerful allies, and, unlike the Indians, could not escape to familiar territories. A totally occupied and conquered people. They were the most vulnerable of all the peoples of the Americas, and I would argue that in many ways we still are. We got to talk about this. I don't like it any more than some of you do, but this is where we are. Sources of English servants began to decline in the latter part of the 17th century as jobs became available at home back in England. The slave trade to Africa increased as internal warfare in Africa made more and more people available for enslavement. So this is the argument you hear often, where people will often comment that that Africans enslaved other Africans. But you cannot make that comparison, because chattel slavery, which is what existed here in the Americas, does not compare to warrior type slaveholding, who were at war with one another. And the slaves that they grabbed were simply during wartime. When the war was over, everybody was let go. So there's no comparison there. So understand history and have the proper perspective on it. Don't try to make comparisons with that. That's an argument I hear a lot. Well, Africans enslaved their own people. Please do the research, read, and find out exactly what that really meant, because nothing compares to the kind of chattel slavery that Africans experienced here in the Americas after the 1600s. So, the slave trade to Africa increased as internal warfare in Africa made more and more people available for enslavement. Leaders of the colonies, all large planters, had two objectives: to impose effective social controls over the population and provide themselves with cheap and easily controlled workers. They readily perceived that they could use the differing physical characteristics of the population to divide them and demarcate some for permanent slavery. Historian Anthony Parent argues that a powerful planter class, acting to further its own economic interests, deliberately brought a new form of servitude, racial slavery, to Virginia over the period of 1690 to 1723. In this period, hundreds of laws were passed restricting the rights of Africans and their descendants. By 1723, even free Negroes were prohibited from voting. Everybody got caught up in the net. Imagine that, knowing freedom and then suddenly not having it anymore. I can't imagine what they were thinking and were going through. Colonial leaders were also doing something else. They were laying the basis for the invention of race and racial identities. They absolutely were. They began to homogenize all Europeans, regardless of ethnicity, status, or social class, into a new category. The first time the term white, rather than Christian, or their ethnic names such as English, Irish, Scot, Portuguese, German, Spanish, Swede. This is why I said we're all ethnicities. This race is a made-up term. Race. It's totally fabricated. This was the first time the term white appeared in public record and was seen in a law passed in 1691 that prohibited the marriage of Europeans with Negroes, or Indians, or mulattoes. A clearly separated category of Negroes as slaves allowed newly freed European servants opportunities to realize their ambitions and to identify common interests with the wealthy and powerful. So now you have whites who had one lower class now coming to a place where they are identifying with the ruling class. What are we seeing in our nation today, folks? This is what I'm asking you to resist the temptation to do. You have nothing in common with the ruling class today. You had nothing in common with them then. And this is what they did. And this is what they try to do today. It's very clever. A clearly separated category of Negroes as slaves allowed newly freed European servants opportunities to realize their ambitions and to identify common interests with the wealthy and powerful. I know I said it once. Laws were passed offering material advantages. Laws were passed offering material advantages. See, this is why I understand the impetus to go along with the ruling class. Trinkets. I get it. That's human nature. I get it. All right? But I just want it understood that this is what's being offered today. The game is still the same. Nothing has changed in terms of the way the ruling class pits one group of people against another. In this way, colony leaders consciously contrived a social control mechanism to prevent the unification of the working poor. Physical features became markers of racial or social status. As Virginia's Governor William Gooch asserted, the Assembly sought to fix a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes. However, the earliest rationale for racial slavery was not differences in physical features, but the identification of Africans as uncivilized heathens, okay? So now we're uncivilized, all right? The first savages, quote unquote, that English had created in their minds were the wild Irish. In the late 16th century, after centuries of conflict and brutal warfare with the Irish, Queen Elizabeth declared that the Irish were natural savages incapable of civilization. Such attitudes generated extreme hatred of the Irish that has continued into the 21st century. In fact, the Elizabethans came very near to racializing the Irish, and in the 18th century the term race was imposed on the Irish. Getting close to the end of this, folks. Native Americans became savages when they resisted English appropriation of their lands. Oh, so when you try to take my land, so suddenly now I'm a savage. But this image began to change in the late 18th century. Now, early in the 18th century, by reducing Africans to permanent slavery, prohibiting owners from freeing slaves, prohibiting their education and training, the English invented a new savage. From the early 18th century on, negative characterizations of Africans formed part of a new rationalization for enslavement. These became the stereotypes of races and race differences that were inherited in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is where it all began, folks. I'm giving you the history. What colony leaders were doing was establishing unequal groups and imposing different social meanings on them. As they were creating the institutional, all right? This has gone beyond individuals now. Now it's becoming institutionalized. This is what we're up against today. As they were creating the institutional and behavioral aspects of slavery, the colonists were simultaneously structuring the ideological components of race. They exaggerated human differences and even invented some that could not be sustained empirically, such as the belief that Negroes had black brains and black blood. By the end of the 18th century, during the Revolutionary era, a great debate over the nature of the Negro had developed. Anti-slavery forces, particularly in Europe, castigated the leaders of the American Revolution for advocating freedom, yet holding more than 2 million people enslaved. In response, pro-slavery proponents developed an ideology about human group differences that dehumanized the Negro and demoted him to a status closer to the ape. Thomas Jefferson was the first to proclaim that we should leave the question of the Negro's status in nature to science, which was just beginning to emerge as a separate and distinct institution in Western culture. So now they're discovering science And now they're going to incorporate the worst aspects in their minds of black people, and they're going to put it in science. They're going to group scientific reasons for their rationale. From the last decade of the 18th century on, the writings of learned men appear to proclaim the natural inferiority of blacks. Folks, this is the history we don't want to talk about, but it's the history we need to know. In the 1860s, slavery ended, but race as social status and the basis of our human identities remain. I started off my first video by asking, where did it come from? What is it and why does it still persist? Now we know. Race ideology proclaimed the existence of separate, distinct, and exclusive groups that were made unequal by God or nature. Now we're going to blame God for it. African Americans, the most inferior, were at the bottom of the hierarchy. European whites, some of them, were at the top. Each race, there we go, each race was thought to have distinct physical and behavior traits that were inherited in the blood and passed on to their children. Thus, we have the continuing stereotype of African Americans as lacking in intelligence, lazy, overly sexed, loud, irrational, musical, emotional, and superstitious. Finally, it was believed that these race differences could not be transcended or transformed. In the 19th century, moving forward, science, using techniques of measuring various aspects of the human body, sought to affirm the differences between blacks and whites and to justify the retention of phenotypically based separate and exclusive groups. In the 20th and 21st centuries, race scientists turned to IQ tests, and the new measure of human differences became primarily intelligence. In the 21st century, race scientists persist in promoting these supposed heritable characteristics of different races. Finally, the legacy of race. This is the legacy about how North American colonists constructed human differences, establishing a hierarchy of races for social, economic, and political purposes. There are many benefits to knowing this history. We have inherited a legacy of enslavement without fully understanding the realities of the 17th century world, in which, in part because most histories taught in 19th and 20th centuries contain negative stereotypes about who our African ancestors were. Modern historians have provided a corrective to such distorted history by restoring accurate accounts of events and their causes, especially the role of Africans in the making of this country. Knowing the broader context in which our ideas and beliefs evolved gives us a better understanding of who we are as human beings, and that was my goal from the very beginning. You must know this history. Most importantly, it forces us to confront the reality of race. There is a passage in the Bible that says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Race is like a vice that constricts our spirits and damages our psyches. I think Thomas Jefferson understood this, despite his ambivalence and apparent moral duplicity, when he wrote about the damages done to white children by the presence of slavery. He wrote, "The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it. From his cradle to his grave, he has learned to do what he sees others do. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, gives a loose to his worst of passions, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot but be stamped by it with odious peculiarities. Children learn what they live. That's basically what he's saying. In everything they see ugly, they simply imitate it as they grow and become adults. So the behavior just gets perpetuated. That's all he's saying. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. Most people can't escape their history. Most people can't escape their upbringing. You'd have to be a special person to escape that. Jefferson was very much aware of these terrible consequences. 2 of his grandchildren beat a slave to death for breaking a cup. I hope this wasn't too long, but I had to read it just as it was, because I thought after reading it for myself, it was so important as an addendum to my first video. Finally, freedom from the lived experiences of racism that so acutely damages especially young African Americans may help to transform our entire society. By expanding freedom and opening up access to cultural knowledge for all people, it may well be that we will come closer to the ideals of equality and opportunity. That's my hope. That's this author's hope. It is my wish that that's also your hope. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, like the page, and I look forward to your comments in the comments section. Don't forget to visit my website, The Marketing Practitioner, for free training on how you might begin to build wealth for yourself and your family. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video. Be safe, everybody. Peace.